Breaking tonight, Canada just challenged American economic dominance. And Australia said, we're in. Alliances are being redrawn across the Pacific tonight. Carney proposed that middle powers unite against economic coercion, but instead of diplomatic caution, Canberra committed to action. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese just announced Mark Carney will address their parliament in March. Everyone believed Davos speeches were performative theater. Political analysts expected diplomatic niceties without substance. Markets assumed Canada's middle power thesis would fade within weeks. They were all utterly incorrect. Sydney, January 25th. Standing before Australian Broadcasting Corporation cameras, Prime Minister Albanese made a statement that energized Ottawa. My friend Mark Carney will visit Australia with an address to the Parliament in March, he declared. Then came the line that reveals everything about what's actually happening. I agree with him. Translation: Australia just told the world that Canada's vision of middle powers acting together isn't theoretical anymore. It's operational. And what happened next? The country that shares Canada's strategic concerns about American economic weaponization reveals exactly why Carney's Davos speech is becoming the blueprint for a new global architecture. Dear viewers, between Davos and now, something extraordinary happened in middle power relationships. Trump threatened allies with tariffs. Carney said enough. And Australia and strategic Pacific-facing Australia became the first nation to publicly commit to turning Canada's thesis into action. This isn't just about one parliamentary visit. This is about the fundamental restructuring of global alliances and the collapse of great power dominance as the only framework for international cooperation. Let's establish context. At Davos, Carney delivered a speech that financial media initially treated as conventional Canadian multilateralism. He called for middle powers to accept the end of the rules-based global order and act together to avoid victimization by American hegemony. Standard diplomatic language, correct? Absolutely wrong. What Carney actually articulated was a declaration of independence from great power patronage systems. He positioned Canada not as America's junior partner seeking protection, but as a middle power with agency, resources, and strategic options. He named the reality everyone else was whispering about, that economic integration has become a weapon and tariffs have become leverage. Trump's response? Immediate criticism. Because Trump recognized exactly what Carney's speech represented, a direct challenge to American economic dominance over allied nations. But here's what matters. While Trump criticized, middle power leaders listened. Albanese in Australia agreed publicly. Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico expressed appreciation for the message. The speech struck a chord, not because of elegant phrasing, but because it articulated what middle power leaders were already thinking. Now watch how theory becomes practice. Albanese didn't just praise Carney's speech. He invited him to address the Australian Parliament. That's not diplomatic courtesy, that's strategic alignment. Parliamentary addresses are reserved for leaders whose vision matters, whose ideas require amplification, whose policies deserve legislative consideration. The timing reveals intentionality. March 2026 places Carney's visit just months after the Davos speech, maintaining momentum while Trump's tariff threats continue escalating. The context matters equally. In October, Canada and Australia signed an agreement deepening cooperation on critical minerals, the exact resource category where both nations face American pressure and Chinese competition. Connect those points. Critical minerals agreement in October. Davos speech in January. Parliamentary visit in March. That's not random scheduling, that's sequential strategy execution. And the substance? Australia faces identical strategic pressures as Canada, geographic distance from America, trade dependence on volatile partners, exposure to Chinese economic influence, vulnerability to great power coercion. Albanese recognizes that Canada's middle power thesis isn't abstract theory, it's practical necessity. Consider what's actually developing here. Carney positions Canada as exemplar of middle power agency. Australia commits to parliamentary engagement. Mexico's leadership expresses alignment. These aren't isolated relationships. They're nodes in an emerging network. Traditional alliance frameworks divided the world into great powers and their dependents. America leads, allies follow, China dominates, neighbors comply, Russia commands, satellites obey. That architecture assumed middle powers lacked agency, resources, or coordination capacity to operate independently. Carney's thesis challenges that assumption directly. Middle powers possess significant economic capacity, technological sophistication, resource endowments, and diplomatic relationships. What they've lacked isn't capability, but coordination. Now watch coordination emerge. Canada articulates the framework. Australia commits to engagement. Mexico signals interest. Each relationship reinforces others. Each commitment demonstrates feasibility. Each partnership expands possibilities. The pattern becomes evident. Middle powers sharing strategic concerns, facing similar pressures, possessing complementary capabilities, starting to act collectively rather than waiting for great power direction. Here's where vision meets implementation. The Davos speech opened doors. The Australia visit demonstrates momentum, but sustainable architecture requires institutional foundation. Some observers are suggesting Carney should formalize middle power coordination through what they're calling an M50 organization, representing 50 of the world's top middle powers. Headquartered at somewhere like British Columbia or Alberta, equidistant for Asian, African, Oceanic, South American, and Maritime and European leaders to travel. Why would this matter? Because it would create permanent infrastructure for middle power coordination that currently doesn't exist. The G7 is dominated by great powers. The G20 includes too many competing interests. Middle powers need their own forum where they set agendas rather than respond to great power initiatives. Consider the practical opportunities. South Africa represents a massive economy where Canada conducts minimal trade. Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, Australia, South Korea. These are substantial economies with shared interests in resisting economic coercion and maintaining strategic autonomy. An M50 framework could coordinate on critical minerals, bypassing great power monopolies. It could establish alternative trade routes, reducing dependence on American or Chinese markets. It could create technology partnerships, building capacity outside existing power structures. The skeptical response suggests this sounds ambitious, perhaps unrealistic, but remember what seemed unrealistic 6 months ago. Canada challenging American economic dominance. Australia publicly aligning with Canadian strategic vision. Middle power leaders treating Carney's thesis as actionable framework rather than theoretical exercise. What changed wasn't capability, it was willingness to acknowledge that great power frameworks no longer serve middle power interests. Economic relationships reveal strategic alignment. Canada needs to expand significantly beyond American trade dependence. Australia faces similar imperatives. Both nations possess resources. China needs, but are wary of Beijing's economic coercion. Both face American tariff threats despite alliance relationships. The October Critical Minerals Agreement between Canada and Australia addresses this directly. Critical minerals represent exactly the sector where middle power coordination creates strategic advantage. Neither nation alone can challenge Chinese processing dominance or American market leverage. Together, with other middle powers, they establish alternative supply chains. Expand that model. Canada and Australia coordinate on critical minerals. Add South Africa's platinum group metals. Include Brazil's rare earths. Incorporate Indonesia's nickel. Suddenly, you're describing a middle power resource network that reduces great power leverage significantly. The trade piece matters because economic relationships enable strategic autonomy. Middle powers dependent on great power markets remain vulnerable to coercion. Middle powers trading primarily with each other build resilience against pressure from any single dominant actor. Carney's Davos speech articulated the political framework. The Australia visit demonstrates diplomatic commitment. Trade relationships would provide economic foundation. That's how theory becomes sustainable practice. One legitimate observation deserves attention. Carney's international relationship building has been exceptional. His credibility with middle power leaders creates opportunities for Canadian influence that didn't exist previously. But some question whether international focus should be balanced with more visible domestic agenda advancement. That's fair criticism requiring nuanced response. International credibility and domestic policy aren't separate categories, they're mutually reinforcing. Canada's ability to negotiate favorable trade relationships depends partly on Carney's standing with foreign leaders. Domestic economic resilience requires international partnerships that reduce American dependency. The Australia visit serves domestic interests directly. Deeper Australian cooperation on critical minerals, technology, and trade creates Canadian jobs, strengthens resource sectors, and builds economic alternatives to American markets. The international work is domestic policy by other means. That said, perception matters in politics. If Canadians perceive Carney as prioritizing international relationships over domestic concerns, political vulnerability develops regardless of actual policy substance. Managing that balance requires visible domestic policy advancement alongside international engagement. The solution isn't choosing between domestic and international focus, it's demonstrating how international relationships serve domestic interests. The Australia visit should be framed not as diplomatic theater, but as economic strategy that creates Canadian opportunities. We're watching the early stages of potential global realignment. For decades, international architecture assumed great power dominance with middle powers as dependent allies. That framework is collapsing not because middle powers suddenly gained capability, but because great powers are increasingly using economic relationships as weapons. Trump's tariff threats against allies, China's economic coercion against trading partners, Russia's energy manipulation of European dependence. These tactics demonstrate that traditional alliance frameworks no longer provide security or stability for middle powers. Carney's Davos speech named that reality. The Australia response shows other middle power leaders recognize it too. The question now becomes whether recognition translates into coordinated action. If middle powers continue operating as isolated actors seeking great power patronage, they remain vulnerable to economic coercion from any dominant partner. If they coordinate strategically, they create collective capacity that reduces vulnerability significantly. The Australia visit represents a test case. Can two middle powers translate shared strategic vision into substantive cooperation? Can parliamentary engagement produce actual policy coordination? Can diplomatic alignment become economic partnership? Those questions matter because they determine whether Carney's middle power thesis remains inspirational rhetoric or becomes operational framework. For Canada specifically, the stakes are existential. Canadian exports to the United States have traditionally accounted for 3/4 of total exports, though recent diversification efforts have begun reducing that concentration to around 67%. That dependence creates vulnerability that threatens Canadian prosperity and sovereignty. Building alternative relationships isn't optional luxury, it's strategic necessity. The Australia partnership matters not because Canberra offers equivalent market size to America, but because it represents diversification away from concentrated dependency. Add Mexico, South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil, South Korea, and other middle powers, suddenly you're describing a trade network that reduces American leverage substantially, not eliminating it, reducing it, creating options where currently there's dependency. That's what Carney's Davos speech proposed. That's what the Australia visit begins implementing. That's what middle power coordination could achieve. The alternative is continuing to operate within frameworks designed for great power dominance, accepting economic coercion as inevitable, hoping for benevolent great power leadership that history suggests rarely materializes. Dear viewers, we're watching something significant develop. Not guaranteed, not inevitable, but possible. A restructuring of global relationships where middle powers act strategically rather than wait for great power direction. Carney articulated the vision at Davos. Albanese committed to action in Sydney. Now we watch whether vision and commitment translate into the institutional architecture and economic partnerships that make middle power coordination sustainable. Because if they do, Canada just helped create the framework that allows middle powers to navigate great power competition without becoming casualties of it. And if they don't, we'll know that speeches, no matter how compelling, can't overcome the structural challenges of coordinating 50 nations with diverse interests. The Australia visit in March becomes the first real test of whether middle power theory can become middle power practice. We'll be watching.